Once again, we find ourselves in the book of Job. I think this will be our final video from the book of Job for now, and then we'll move on to something else. By now, if you've been watching these videos, hopefully you've taken time to go through the story of Job and refresh yourself with that, and so you can follow along a little bit better. But we have this story of Job, right? And he has so much. It says that he's the wealthiest man in his land, and then he loses it all because Satan challenges God on Job's faithfulness. And so God wants to demonstrate that Job's faithfulness to him is not based on his blessing, his financial or his health or any quality of life kind of blessing that Job has on him, but rather it's on his understanding of God. And Job holds true that he doesn't curse God. He continues to honor God. Even in his frustration and his questioning, he honors God. God speaks to Job. God speaks to his friends. We talked about that last week. And then God does something very interesting. In chapter 42, this is the last chapter of the book, God first tells Job's friends that they need to make an offering and ask Job to pray for them. And then he will forgive them of their folly, of their wrongdoing. And Job does that. He prays for them. And they're forgiven. They make this needed sacrifice. But in verse 10 of chapter 42, it says, "And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him all of his brothers and sisters, who all had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. And the Lord blessed the later days of Job more than the beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters." Then it goes on about the names of the daughters. He called the name of the first daughter Jemiah, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Karen Hapuch. Hapuch, I don't know. I might be butchering those names. And in the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. And after this, Job lived 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons, 4 generations. And Job died an old man, full of his days. It's a very neat part of the story. It's obviously a very short part of the story, 42 chapters, and here we have 17 verses about the restoration of Job after he's gone through this great trial and great pain and suffering in his life. Now, some have said that this shows that when we stay with our righteousness that we don't suffer. Once again, I simply don't see that, because Job was right with God from the start. That's how he is introduced to us. And yet he still was allowed to suffer. And as we talked in a previous lesson, that God allowed him to suffer, first that God may be glorified, but also that Job's trust in God would be strengthened beyond what it was before. And so through that, he's blessed in that. Now, it's kind of God to give him this wealth back, to give him that status back. And that's the right word. It's kind. He's not bound to do that. He's not required to do that. Job actually says, I believe he says there earlier in the text, that the Lord gives and the Lord's taken away. And he's just to do that. He's able to do that. He's ultimate in that, right? And so the things that God gives to us, wonderful, that's great. And at times when they're taken from us, they're taken for a reason. And God has a reason for doing that. But it's out of his grace that he gives these things back to Job. But it is kind of a reminder to us as the Christian, so many years later after this story unraveled with Job, is that we will face trials. We will face suffering. Jesus has promised us that the world will hate us. But don't worry, it hated him first. And that we will go through persecution. We will go through suffering. We will have problems that we'll face. But if we remain faithful to God in those times, then we will be blessed. Now that might sound weird because you have heard me said many, many times that I despise the health and wealth gospel. And to be clear, that's absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you will be blessed with health, or you will be blessed with wealth, or you'll be blessed with a grand quality of life. But we will receive a blessing that goes beyond those things. Job was restored in his resources. He had children. He was restored in his status of those around him. And he was restored in the quality of his life. In the midst of his pain and suffering, he said, Lord, I wish I had never existed. Take me now. Can I just please die? But in the restoration, he lived twice as long as he already had, 140 extra years. And he got to see those generations and his kids and their kids and their kids and their kids. And the fullness of his life. He was restored beyond what he could have even imagined. I mean, you think about, he was the wealthiest man in the land. To think of someone wealthier than him was hard to do. And yet it had doubled. And the reality is that to you, Christian, I'm speaking, you will be restored beyond what you can imagine. But it might not show up in your bank account, and it might not show up in your quality of life here, but in the next. And that God has gone to prepare a place for us, and He's restoring us and sanctifying us and bringing us into that place. The trick is to remember that in those hard times, in those sufferings, that we keep that attitude of Job, that sure, we might have questions, and don't think that we can somehow judge God, but that we remain faithful to God and follow after Him and recognize that He has a reason for what He's doing. But in the midst of Job's pain, in chapter 19, he's crying out, and this is where he says, oh, that my words were written, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead, that they were engraved in a rock forever. And he's talking about the pain that he's going through and the lesson that he's learning and these kind of things, that if only this was written down. And thankfully it was, because it's such an important story and it's so important for us to learn this lesson. But he says, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. What an interesting thing to say. And I hope that in your struggles, in your pain, in the suffering that you'll go through, and the questions of why that you'll come to, you'll also be able to make that plea and that cry that Job made and say, I know that my Redeemer lives. It's so comforting to know, although I stumble here, I will walk in peace there. Although I weep here, I know there will be a day where God will wipe every tear. Although at times I feel distant and not in peace, I will walk in perfection, in peace, in the glory of God, as I walk the streets of heaven and the new earth. There's nothing like that. That's the end of the book of Job. We should also take another look at the start of the book of Job, right? So we get this introduction to Job, who he was, what he was like. He's a good man, all that stuff. We've talked about that. But then we see this conversation between God and Satan, where they show their true natures. God shows the nature that He will be glorified, that He's strong, that He's a redeemer, and He knows the faithfulness of His people. Satan shows his true nature in that he desires to see God be ridden of His glory. He desires nothing more than to see the servants of God abandon their faith, curse God, and denounce Him and hate Him and whatnot. Don't be fooled. Satan did not just pull at the heartstrings of Job and try to get him to curse God. He comes around you and desires to get you to curse God. He desires to pull you away from God. In 1 Peter, he's described as a roaring lion walking the streets looking for who he may devour. And so to you I say, be on guard. Recognize that there will be troubles in this life that are aimed at you. That as you pursue God, the devil wants to pull you away from Him. He does not want God to receive the glory. He does not want him to be honored by your life and your living and your attitude and your will and your mind and your prayers. He wants nothing more than to see you curse God, to abandon your faith. That you'll come to struggles, and instead of saying, my Redeemer lives, you'll say, obviously I am alone in despair, but you are not. God is with you, holding on to you, helping you, guiding you, strengthening you. There was also, at the end there, it says that his brothers and sisters came around him, and they comforted him. These are the ones who, in Job's crying out, he said that his wife had left him, that she didn't recognize his breath, that his brothers and sisters, they wanted nothing to do with him, and then they came around. They are what we would call fair weather friends. They're there when things are good, and they abandon them when they're not. To your brothers and sisters in the church, do not be a fair weather friend. Don't just be around them when they're happy and when life is good, but when they find themselves in the storm and struggles, whether they're tiny in comparison to Job's or sometimes they seem to match up. Stand with them. Comfort them, not with accusation as Job's friends did, but comfort them and pray for them and love them and build them up and encourage them to hold on to God and recognize that He is still with us in those storms. Pastor David did a wonderful video there just this past couple days ago. When this will come out, it'll be a couple days ago, on peace and how God gives us peace and what that looks like. Job, although he went through this great trouble, he ended up being restored. And not just with finances and with new children and with the respect of the people around him, but he got restored further beyond that because his trust in God and God's ways and his understanding of who God was, that also grew substantially. That is of more value than 1,000 ox or the respect of your brothers and sisters. Your trust and understanding of God, it is one of the greatest blessings that you can have. Trust in God. I hope that's encouraging for you today. That is, I believe, will be the last of our thoughts pulled from the book of Job for now. I'm sure at some point we will come back to it because I absolutely love this book. I hope you guys have a good week, and whatever you face in this week, good or bad, recognize that you're not alone. God is with you. He desires to grow your faith. Stand firm in Him and His ways. Have a good week.